So to kind of tie this into how we model things, I have a simple cartoon here of schematic of how we have earthquakes. We have earthquake at depth, is going to be on a fault. And let's say we're interested in our site, which is going to be a house. Let's say we have some soil, which is represented by the sediment basin beneath it, and then some rock at some very deep depth. So for ground motion models, we try to predict intensities, which are represented by this mu LNIJ. So it's the mean log intensity for earthquake I at site J. Let's assume earthquake I occurs on this fault. It's going to slip. We're going to have some level of shaking. We have a source term, FE, which is a function of source parameters, so magnitude, mechanism, things like that. And that'll give us kind of this initial level of shaking at the earthquake at depth. We then have a path term, which is the focus of today's talk, which will quantify how does that amplitude change with distance as the wave propagates from the earthquake towards our site. And this is usually in deeper crestal materials, so not to be confused with the shallower sediment deposits on the surface. And generally speaking, it's always going to be a reduction of energy because we're going to have friction and other things like that, which I'll go into in the next section of how our amplitudes decrease. And then the last part is how do our waves get from the ground, deep in our ground, to our site, which is on the surface. And this is the whole complex world of site effects, which that can be a whole nother presentation. We don't need to go on into the details of that, because that's a tangent I don't think we have time for.
And it's difficult to decouple site and path in this case, right?
Yes, it can be very difficult to decouple path from not just the site effects, but also, as we'll see later on, sometimes it's difficult to decouple path from source effects.
That's true. Okay.
Yeah, so path is kind of that oddball child that wants to be with everyone, but makes it very complicated for us to do our empirical work.
And now, so you said, this is interesting because you've got the wave propagation, the attenuation over to the base of the basin. And I guess that's where paths get interesting, is when you've got these changes in, you don't have a uniform path. Is this what they mean when people, the basic ground motion equations are done at 760?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're propagated, or they're modified for the VS30. But so is that when I talk about VS30 760, is that where it would be at the base?
Yes.
Or would it be at the surface that would represent, because all our instruments are at the surface, right? So, but
yes.
It kind of represents that.
So
right?
In the ground motion model, the 760 condition is representative of of this rock soil interface. It's kind of a loose definition in my opinion, but it works. It is true that most of pretty much all of our sensors are on the ground surface, but many of those are on what we would call an outcropping, a rock outcropping. So we can have an instrument that's up here on the ground surface, and this is still rock. So our site condition is still 760. So we can use this information to predict what we would have down here. And then the FS term, the site term, is trying to quantify all of the weird phenomena that goes on through the shallow soil layer.
Okay, so the FS would be how you would modify. It's a modification almost from the 760.
Exactly.
Term.
If you have a VS30 of 760, your FS is pretty much disappears. You only have the path term and the E term.
Okay, and I guess that makes that assumption on the rock. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, now you know why I don't always pay attention to too many presentations, because otherwise I'd have a million questions. But I've got you here, and I think this is, I get to learn a lot about ground motions and have my own private lesson. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's great also having the conversation during the presentation.
Yeah, well, English is my second language, and so I'm used to having to pay attention to the words that are said, and so it makes me question every little term and everything on there. So cool. And why does your damping not start at 0?
So there's always a minimum level of damping, which would be part of the linear small strain damping. It's never actually 0.
Okay. And this is just radiation damping?
Hysteretic damping for soils.
Oh, and so the radiation damping would be separate.
Yeah, radiation damping for the wavefront you're asking?
I don't know, when I'm talking about modeling in open seas and things like that, when you're talking about soils and soil structure interaction, there's the radiation damping term. And then the hysteretic, which to me is when you're doing nonlinear, which here makes sense. I see it because he's starting low, but then as the strain, which is a function of the PGA, I assume, on rock. So this is your hysteretic damping. So this is in a nonlinear response, right? So it's pretty low initially, but as your strains go up. So the radiation damping will be separate. Or maybe that's what
I
that
think
really low
DMIN
value is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you start off with just radiation damping, which is constant. It's independent of the strain. But then as your soil goes nonlinear, you've got more damping. And so where does that term go in? Where is that term here?
So that's worked into the nonlinear term of the site term.
Okay.
And we don't exactly use the modulus reduction and damping curves that as shown here. But those mechanisms that are represented by those constitutive models for soil strength and damping, the dynamic properties, are kind of built into this nonlinear term.
Right. And so you've got the three terms here, right? You've got the linear, the basin.
Yes.
Okay. And then the nonlinear term. Oh, cool. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. So then to wrap this section up, if we just recall that ergodic is when the time average, in ergodic random process is when the time average equals the ensemble average, and we know that the underlying process of the ground motion is non-ergodic. That's kind of highlighted by the fact that there's spatial variability.
That should have a T, not a C, but
exactly. Oh, thank you.
Well, it's funny because it's always a joke with Italian. We pronounce it when you spelled that way, it's special variability. And so I'm always no, it's not special, it's spatial. And so I like how you did like a little combination of spatial, but yes, thank you.
Well, thank you for pointing out the typo. I have to update that in the slide.
I like it. It's like a combination. It's like multi-language. So welcome to my ADHD. I notice all these little things that are irrelevant. So sometimes it's worth it though.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just to go back to recall the big definitions, and I want to tie that into now ground motion models. We've talked about ergodicity, but now what is an ergodic model? It's in a model that's developed under that ergodic assumption. So when you take all of the global data, use it together to make one model that you can apply in California, in Italy, in Japan, anywhere, that's an ergodic model. A non-ergodic model is one that attempts to transform the underlying non-ergodic process that is ground motion into the ergodic one. So in other words, you're trying to remove spatial trends in the residuals, and this can be with respect to distance, or it can be with respect to site condition, or with respect to magnitude and other predictor variables. So don't just try to think when I say spatial trends that it's a physical spatial trend. It can be a parameter spatial trend. And
go ahead. I'll let you finish and then I'll ask my question.
So then that leads to kind of a big point of this presentation, which is that, in my opinion, ground motion models live on a spectrum between either being fully ergodic, where you use all of the data in the world for one site, or fully non-ergodic, where you pretty much just use all of data that's only applicable for your site or your scenario to predict it. And then there's a whole spectrum of in-betweens.
Okay, I got a couple of questions on this. Now, the ergodicity on it, you can apply to different parts of your model though, right? So you can have, like, for example, the source model. We don't have that many earthquakes, right? So we can't really, so a fully non-ergodic, and this non-ergodic is like a double negative. I think that's what throws people off. But it's almost like more site specific, but more than that. If we had, lots of earthquakes at our site with a lot of instruments, Well, no, because all earthquakes that are felt by our site at all locations, then even the source model would be non-ergodic. And so it really depends on the different components, right, that you can apply to it. And I guess that's why it wouldn't be fully non-ergodic, because you may only be playing with one path of it. Now, this line that you're saying here, the non-ergodic model transforms the underlying non-ergodic process into an ergodic one. So what does that mean that you're transforming it? I thought it was just.
So recall that the non-ergodic process is representative of ground motion. So we have effects that at a site, you're never going to record usually the same amplitude of a ground motion. Whereas ergodic would be one where, doesn't matter what the thing is, there's always one true value. Think like the coin flip. It's always going to be 50%. There's some noise in your results for each trial, but you have a value that you should always get.
The truth, what Norm calls the truth.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the non-ergodic model is trying to capture or to assign. The non-ergodic model is trying to capture the effects that can be attributed to, for example, magnitude differences, distance differences, site condition differences, so that if you plug in those factors into your model, the only thing that's going to change, or that you will get the truth value for your site. It's a little bit difficult to kind of wrap your mind around.
Okay, but you're just using the same type of format, but you're modifying it more to your case.
To your scenario.
To your scenarios. Okay, so now let's go into the parentheses. And the first word, see, I'm a structural engineer, so I've got you here. And I know it becomes a whole other topic, but you put the word in, and when you put a word in, and I have to understand what it means. And you're talking about spatial trends, which is fine. It's the effect of space. But why residuals? What are residuals, and why is it important here?
So in the world of ground motion modeling, we develop them from data. But with the data, we don't just use it as is. We compute what is called a residual, and that is going to be the difference, or rather the log difference, between the observation, what we record, and what we predict by a model. So if it's a perfect model, the residual will be 0. That doesn't usually happen. It's usually either going to be positive if you're going to be under-predicting, negative if you're over-predicting. And so based off of whether you have positive or negative residuals versus some predictor variable, you can update or modify your ground motion model so that it becomes closer to a unbiased model that gives you truth values.
Okay, and so it's kind of what you use as a tool for developing the different components of your ground motions, right? And exactly. So if we go back, can you go back like the slide that shows the 3 different components? Yeah, so right here, okay? So this is what my understanding of it is, and you tell me, all right? So first I build a model, because residuals is an interesting topic. So first I build my model, and this is what I've seen people do. So first I only deal with the event data, okay? And so I build my model, and I compute. See, here's a residual. So then I've seen people do plots of residuals versus, what would be on the x-axis? Maybe magnitude? No, okay, distance, okay? So let's put this as distance, right? But I'm using just this model. And so what I'm finding is that this model works really well at short distances, but then I see the residuals trending up, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is now telling me, hey, your model is over-predicting or under-predicting?
Under-predicting.
Okay, under-predicting. Okay, because this is some sort of log of the difference. Okay, so if this is R, so now, and so that was, just for this. Now I'm going to develop a new model. So I'm going to go, hey, I see. And I guess that's what tells you. You plot it against different parameters and you see trends, because that's what you said in the next slide. You see trends in spatial, right? So you've got a trend here with distance. I'm like, oh, I'm going to add an r squared term, let's say, right? And so now I plot my residuals. Okay, let's call them lowercase r. Okay, in this model. And I've used up magnitude, I've used up mechanism, I've used up difference, or distance. So let's put in VS30. Okay, now I see something with VS30, let's put this at 7, whatever, and then there's a trend here. But now my residuals are much smaller than they were with the distance because they're there. And so now you figure out, oh, it increases or it decreases. So I got to bring in a VS30 term and so on, right? And so I guess that's the importance of residuals.
Exactly.
Is to give you an idea of trends, is it, or maybe if I put in, let's put something irrelevant, the number of bedrooms in my house, okay, then your residual, let me change colors. My residual is going to be all over the place, but it averages to whatever the average is. It doesn't have to be 0 because it means I'm still missing a term. But, and so if the average is 0, you're happy. You've got a good model if on average, but there's still, and you don't see too many trends. And so that tells you that the number of bedrooms is not a critical parameter because you don't see it in the residuals. And to me, this is a cool machine learning application or artificial intelligence applications, is being able to take in a million random variables and see which one measures the different things. So fascinating. So that's what I've learned about residuals. Is kind of like it's the iterative process of how far off is my model from the actual truth, right? Or the measured values.
Exactly. That's exactly how we use them.
Okay. Oh, cool. All right. Thank you.
Of course.
I'll let you
Oh, can you clean up your annotation?
Yeah, welcome to my life, always cleaning up my messes. I clean up all the drawings. All right, thank you.
Of course. Did you have any other comments or questions for this slide?
No, this one only has 5 lines, so we're good.
Okay. So